Hello, everyone. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today. And before I start, I would like to apologize if this phone is ringing. This is a phone for on-call mushroom poisoning. So in case there is a mushroom poisoning, I will have to answer. This is the Victoria Poison Information Center. Hopefully, most people don't have mushroom for breakfast. They usually have more for lunch or dinner, so it may ring in the afternoon. But well, I apologize if the phone rings. I will have to answer, so I will just put it here for now. So as I said, well, thank you so much for the kind invitation. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about a topic that I've been working for now the past 7-8 years, which is the Wood Wide Web or mycorrhizal networks. And as Alison very kindly and very nicely introduced it, there's been a lot of stories about the Wood Wide Web. And today I wanted to tell you a little bit about what scientific evidence have about the Wood Wide Web compared to what all the stories says, like in the movies or in the books or etc. So let's just. Okay, so before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians for this land and pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. And I also would like to recognize the cultural and scientific knowledge of Australian plant, fungi, and animal held by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for millennia. And so, the Wood Wide Web, I think, needs no introduction nowadays. I'm sure that many of you have seen the video from the BBC about trees talking to each other. There's millions of you about these videos. The books, the movies, they even, as Alison was saying now, there's artists that start to be interested in the Wood Wide Web, activities for children. I found this on, is it here? On Melbourne, on a webpage about Melbourne activities for children about the Wood Wide Web. So I'm pretty sure that even people who know nothing about trees or very little about trees, they know something about the Wood Wide Web, right? And so what I would like to tell you today, as I was telling you, is what do we really know actually about the Wood Wide Web, and are all the popular claims that we see in these books and movies, are they really supported by scientific evidence? And so this whole debate started mostly a few years ago with a great friend of colleague of mine, Professor Justin Karts, who is a professor at the University of Alberta in Canada. And by seeing all the stories, the news article, and something about the Wood Wide Web, she started to question, and actually I think many scientists, we started to question when I read on the New York Times, on the ABC radio, people talking about this fungi Wood Wide Web. And I started to talk about, like, wait a second, when did this happen? You know, like sometimes even as scientists, we're a little bit like, what is happening here, you know? Which is a great, like Alison was saying, it's a great recognition of fungi, and it's great to put more, like fungi more like in the light of, and so that more people get interested into it. But at the same time, as scientists, I guess we want to know the evidence. When someone tells me something, even a colleague, I'm always like telling him, show me the data. I want to see it with my eye. I want to test it and everything. I guess this is a little bit of a passion we have with like scientific evidence. But I do think this is important, especially for people who work with forest restoration. And so, again, I'm not going to say, I think we all like good stories. I love this movie scene in the Lord of the Rings where, you know, the hobbits, they get lost in the forest, they decide to spend the night, and then so they find a nice tree, they spend the night on the tree, and then during the night, suddenly they wake up and they're like, oh my God, the trees are talking, right? I think this is a wonderful metaphor. And by no means I'm here today to tell you that it's not good to have stories. But I do still think that it's important to see how much scientific evidence we base on these stories. Because these stories have started to be so big that it has started to influence decision-making. These politicians who start to make ideas, you know, they decide to fund projects based on Wood Wide Web or something, you know, something like this. It even has started to influence scientists. This is what most worried Justin when she started her review, is that even scientists themselves start to interpret the data in a way that goes with this idea of the World Wide Web, while there's sometimes a lot of alternative explanations that are totally overlooked. And then I think, and also that's why I proposed to Ellen to do this talk today, I think lots of you work with forest management, and so it has a lot of impact on the way we are going to manage forests. And so, just as a short introduction, let's go back a little bit about what do we know about the World Wide Web that is based on scientific evidence. And so, I mean, we had this wonderful introduction by Alison. Thank you so much for doing this. You did all the hard work for me, actually. So just as a short summary, we all know that mycorrhizal association, it's symbiosis, so it's a mutualistic interaction. It's beneficial for both partner interaction between the root of plant and fungi in the soil. Some of them produce mushrooms, some of them don't. They only live as mycelium in the soil. And they are going to exchange sugars that come from photosynthesis from the plants with nutrients, right? And so something that we know, this is well established, this has been studied in many parts of the world, in many forests. We know that one plant can associate with even more than 30 fungal species. So this is quite a large diversity for one individual plant, or especially trees, right? And so this is what we call mycorrhizal networks. And there is always a question about, so why would a plant associate with so many, right? I mean, I have one partner. I'm really happy with him. Like, I don't need to have like 30 husbands. Right? So why do they do this? And the reason that plants do this is that it helps them to adapt to the environment. So basically, if there is a little bit of drought, then some fungi are better at getting nutrient under drought conditions. And so for the plant, it's good to be able to associate with this. But then at some time of the year, then the soil gets more wet. Some fungi are going to be better at getting nutrient for the plant when it's wet. And so that's why the plant associates with all these different partners, because depending on the condition, she's going to partner and give more sugar to like one or the other. But something that is very important to remember, and I think this is something that I have seen many plans of forest management that sometimes forget about this, is that they're actually very different, they're different mycorrhizal type. But what I mean by this is, as again, Alison introduced you to this very well, there are actually different kind of fungi. These fungi, they are very different from each other. They are as different from each other as a fly and a fish, honestly. It's different, what we call them fungal phyla. So it's very different like group of organisms. So they all associate with the root of plant. They all give nutrient to the plant in exchange for sugar. But they do this in very different ways. They have different structures. It's a different group of fungi that associate with different plant groups. So we're going to have a talk this afternoon about the orchid mycorrhizae. So the orchid, they associate with a type of fungi. But eucalypts, they associate with another type of fungi called ectomycorrhizae. Crops, like corn or many crops, they associate with another type of fungi, which is called arbuscular mycorrhizae. And so this is important when we talk about ecology or forest management, because these different groups, they're going to all give nutrient to the plant, but they do it in very different ways. And so it's really hard. This is something that I think for fungi in general, as a mycologist, I have to fight with this all the time, because people ask me, so do fungi do this or do fungi do that, or how do fungi do something? Fungi is an extremely diverse group of organisms. We're talking about 5 million species, and they obviously have very different ways of living, right? So it's really hard to make generalities about what fungi do. And for mycorrhizae, this is the same. And so as an example, this is maybe a bit technical. I hope we can just go through it like very simply. You're going to see it's not so complicated. So basically, plants, for the nutrition, they get their sugar from the photosynthesis, but they also need minerals. So nitrogen, phosphorus, minerals. And the plant itself, it cannot get the mineral from the soil by itself. It just cannot do this. The plant, we know, doesn't have the enzyme to degrade the organic matter. So basically, the plant leaves have nitrogen. The plant leaves fall on the floor, on the forest floor. The plant cannot access the nitrogen that is in this leaf because it's trapped in the organic matter. Right? And so it needs the mineralization of the organic matter by microbes. It can be fungi, but it can also be bacteria. And then the mycorrhizal fungi, what are they going to do is that they're going to help the mining. So they're going to go in the soil, forage, find all these nutrients, and bring them back to the plant. And so the arbuscular mycorrhizae, for example, the one that associate with grass, crops, they can stimulate the mineralization. So what they do is that they secrete the sugar they receive from the photosynthesis. They secrete it in the soil. They give it to like bacteria, and the bacteria are going to do the mineralization, and then they transfer it to the plant. But they don't do mineralization. They don't. We know this because they don't have enzyme to do this. To study this, you look at the genomes, and so you see, do they have the genes to produce this enzyme? If they don't have the genes, they will not produce the enzymes. And so we know they don't do this. While ectomycorrhizae, the one that associate with eucalypts, for example, some group, again, no generalization, some group actually have the enzyme to decompose the organic matter themselves. So you see, they all give nutrients, especially nitrogen, to the plant, but they do it in very, very different ways. And obviously, you cannot treat all of them the same. And one thing that is very important when you do forest restoration, the first thing you have to think is, what is the mycorrhizal type of the species I'm interested to restore? Are they arbuscular mycorrhizae? Are they ectomycorrhizae? Are they orchid mycorrhizae? Because this has going to be a lot of influence on how you're going to do your restoration plant in the soil, right? Okay. And so there's other things that is important to know about the mycorrhizal symbiosis. The first thing is that the fungi are what we call obligate symbiont. So the fungus needs the plants to get sugars. These fungi, they have no other way to get sugars. They really need the plant. While the plant doesn't really need the mycorrhizal fungi. It's not an obligate symbiont. It could get the nutrient from other sources. If the bacteria, for example, in the soil are doing the mineralization, if you give nutrient to the plant with fertilizer, it doesn't need the fungi anymore. And so we know the fungi is entirely dependent on the plant for sugar. But we also know that for a very long time, people were thinking, okay, so there is this trading, right? The plant is giving the carbon, and the fungi is giving the nutrient, and so it has a cost for the plant. Each time it wants to have nutrient, it has to pay with sugar, right? But what we have discovered in recent years is that the plant has a lot of sugar to give. Most plants, especially, I think, if you think of the eucalypts, all the nectar that they produce every year, right, the entire time. So the plant is not really limited in carbon. It's not like it has to be like, oh, okay, this is the end of the month, how many carbon do I have, can I still trade? No, the plant is like a millionaire with carbons, right, with sugar. So it's not really a cost for the plants. And so and this is something that is very, very important, especially for forest management and for nurseries, is that the limiting factor for the plant is actually the nutrient. So the plant is going to need the fungi only if there is not enough nutrient in the soil. And so as an example, this is a study that we just published. I'm really happy about this because this is my first published study in Australia. Thank you. It was mostly done by a student from Uni Melbourne, where she looked at the use of compost tea. Do you guys know compost tea? Have you used it before? So they looked at the use of compost tea in a nursery in Melbourne, and really what she wanted to do in this case, she wanted to test exactly the process that the nursery was doing with this compost tea, and to test if it helps the tree to get mycorrhizae or not. And so in this nursery, this is what they use for the compost tea, and they actually even added wood balls. So they added wood in the compost tea to help like the mycorrhization. Right? And so we did this study, but what we found is that actually the compost tea does not contain any mycorrhizal fungi in it. And also because this compost tea, when we talk about fertilization, usually I feel it has some kind of negative aspect, we think about chemicals or something, but there's a lot of ways to naturally fertilize the soil, like compost tea, for example. So this compost tea actually fertilized the soil. And so basically when she looked at treatment, right? She did, she grew plants without compost tea and with compost tea, and then she checked, was the tree growing better? The tree was actually growing pretty good with the compost tea. But the ectomycorrhizae, so this is Corymbia, this is one species that associates with ectomycorrhizae, the colonization rate so how much fungus was colonizing the root actually dropped drastically. Because what happened, if the plant has enough nutrient, you give the plant nutrient with the compost tea, then it doesn't need the fungi anymore. And so the plant was not colonized anymore, right? So it's important to remember that in order to have some control in the soil, because the fungus does need these sugars, it needs to grow on low nutrient soil. And that's why many, many forests, including in Australia, grow actually on low nutrient soil. It was a big discovery in the end of the 90s that we always thought like, oh, so these forests, these huge trees, they must grow on very fertile soil. No, the forests, the ectomycorrhizal forests, they grow on low nutrient soil because of this fungi. And if you give them more nutrient, where is he, Luke? So one of my PhD students is actually working on this now. If you give a lot of nutrient, like nowadays with air contamination, there is nitrogen deposition in the soil, you're going to change the composition of the forest. Because these trees, they are used to live with these fungi in the low nutrient condition. And if you put more nutrient in the soil, then maybe other plants that don't have this strategy are going to be more competitive and are going to take over. Okay? Good. So another example of this is places where I was lucky enough to do a postdoc there. So I was for 3 years in Nothofagus forest in Patagonia. So Nothofagus in Patagonia, it's the dominant tree. I mean, here in Victoria, I feel it looks a little bit like a relic species from the past, unfortunately, right? But there in Patagonia, this is the dominant tree. It's also, this species is deciduous, so you have this wonderful color in the fall. And what we did there is exactly the same. We wanted to look at what's the influence of these fungi in the soil for the nutrient cycling of this forest. And so basically, just to really go through it. So this is the tip of South America in the Patagonia, so southern tip of South America. We collected a sample, soil sample, in different kind of forests and also in the steppe area. And so for each soil sample, what you can do is using DNA, you can identify what are the fungus what are all the fungi community that are in the soil. And then we also measured the enzymes. So as Alison really kindly introduced, fungi, they secrete the enzyme in the environment and then they ingest the results. And so for us, it's very useful because then we can just take the soil sample and the enzyme are there and we can measure the activity of this enzyme. And then we looked at the soil factor in the soil, how much nutrient was in the soil, what was the pH, and etc. And so what we found in this forest was very intriguing, but also very interesting, is that so this Nothofagus pumilo, this is the tree that has the highest nitrogen content in the leaf. And so because of that, people always thought, so it has very high nitrogen content in the leaf, the soil must be the most fertile soil, right? Very logic. And what we found, it was actually exactly the opposite. The nitrogen in the soil was the lowest that we found. So it actually grew on very, very low nutrient soil. But it has a very high diversity of I put ECM fungi for ectomycorrhizae fungi, right? And also a high activity of this fungal enzyme. And so this is something that we found in Patagonia, but it has also been shown in other parts of the forest, for example, in the boreal zone. We know that these ectomycorrhizal fungi, they enhance the nitrogen limitation. So they need to grow on low nitrogen soil. If you give more, if there's more nitrogen in the soil, they're going to disappear or they're going to reduce because they're not competitive anymore, right? And so Also, what we know is that they're going to favor the dominance of nothofagus. So these forests, they are almost what we call monodominant. There was only nothofagus as tree. No other tree can grow there. Because if you don't associate with these fungi, you have no nitrogen. So somehow this intricate relationship between these fungi and the plant makes them very competitive in this low nutrient environment. And so the other plants cannot grow. But if you change this system, obviously it's going to be bad for the fungi, and somehow at some point it may also be bad for the tree, because then other plants may take over. This is what happened in nothofagus. They have a little bit of problem sometimes with fire disturbance, but the biggest problem they have in Patagonia is actually with beaver. So people in the 1940s, they introduced beaver in Patagonia to enrich the biodiversity of the place. I know it sounds crazy, but they did it. And so the beaver are totally destroying the forest. And what happened when there is the beaver, they make this big dam, and then grasses come over. Grasses, they associate with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, with other type of mycorrhizae, right? And so they take over, and obviously the beaver, it's just pooping everywhere. So it's a lot of fertilization everywhere. And so the tree has a really hard time to take over, because the tree has to live on this very nitrogen-limited environment. Okay, so now that we know more about mycorrhizal fungi, let's talk a little bit about the wood wide web. And so the wood wide web is what we call common mycorrhizal network. So there's mycorrhizal network. There's many studies. We know they exist in the soil. We know what they do. I mean, there's still a lot that we need to know, but this is something that is established. But common mycorrhizal network, this is something slightly different. It means that trees from the same or different species are going to be connected between them in the soil through this network of mycorrhizal fungi, right? And so what I would like to see with you a little bit is, I mean, there's lots of says about this wood wide web, but there are we're going to see here 3 things that I think are repeatedly said in the popular claims that are repeatedly said. And I would like to explore with you if there is really scientific evidence about this. And also something that I would like to mention, as I said before, I have nothing about great stories. I love good stories. And I think the lot of concern that we have as scientists about these claims is that sometimes, especially in the, I would say in the media, in the press media, the claim, so there's a popular claim that says that there is scientific evidence. I read this all the time. Oh, scientists have found that this, you know, ABC radio. And I'm like, wait a second, where is the publication? So I think this is also something that, you know, people all like good stories, but you're not stupid. You know what is the difference between a story and between science, right? And so the problem with this thing is that when the stories is really nice, but at some point, if people claim that the story is based on scientific evidence when it's not, then this is when I think we have a problem. And so the first claim is that these common mycorrhizal networks, so the wood wide web, they are widespread in forest. Basically, all the forests everywhere have these, right? And so how do we study this? To study this, we have to map this fungal network in the soil. And this is what, the thing is a little bit close. So this is an example of what people have been doing. One study was the famous study by Susan Simard in Canada. She worked with Douglas fire. Pseudotsuga menziesii. And then there's a study in Japan that did this working with pine. And so basically they went in the soil, they collected mycelium and roots everywhere, and they mapped it with DNA. They tried to see, is it really the same fungal individual that goes from one tree to the other? Because if you have the same fungal species, this is something that is established. We know the trees in the forest, they associate with these 30 species, right? And the same species can associate with another tree over there. But in order to be connected, it has to be the same individual, the same hyphae that go all the way, right? And so this is what they did, and this is what they showed. And they did show that there was this fungal genet that was, I think, about 20 meters, that were going from one tree to the others. But the first thing that I'd like to mention is that this is 2 studies. Oh, no, sorry. I think that this one, they repeated it a few times. This is 5 studies across 2 forest types, 2 plant species. There are, I think, 7,500,000 tree species in the world. Is this really something that we can say that this is frequent? There's 2. This is conifers that associate with this ectomycorrhizae. In Australia, the conifers that we have, like the hope pine, for example, they don't associate with ectomycorrhizae. They associate with arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. So they associate with another type of mycorrhizae. So could we really say, based on these 2 studies, that this is something that is everywhere? I said maybe, but we have to test this further, right? And then another thing also that people with new evidence have started to question is that we don't know, even if one mycelia really go from one tree to the other tree 20 meters away, how long is it going to persist in the soil? Is it really something that is permanent, or is it just something that, you know, for like a couple of days or something? Because we know that the mycelium in the soil is being grazed by invertebrates. We know that it decays, so it's the mycelium in the species stay in the soil for a really long time, but the mycelium itself doesn't stay for very long. It can be a couple of weeks, and then it dies, and then it keeps growing another part. And so the question is, even though there is a connection, is this connection really permanent and staying for year-round? We have this connection in the soil between the trees, right? And so as an example, I have to thank Justine for this because she sent me this slide. So basically, if we imagine that this is 2 trees and this is the root, right? And then some of them connect with the fungus here. And then in order to have the woodward web, this same fungal species needs to connect these 2 roots, right? But what happens very often, and it has been shown by scientific evidence in the soil, is that sometimes this is what happens. The hyphae get cut. You know, a snail passed by and just ate a little bit of hyphae. This happens all the time. It just died at this point. Then you still have the same fungal genet if you do this mapping, but then they're not connected anymore, right? And so this can happen. The fungal genotype, yeah, as I said, they found it was about 20 meters away, like 1 genet, but it can still be, it could still be fragmented, right? And so even if we map these fungal genet in the soil of fungal network, we could have the same genotypes, but this is not connected. So this is not woodward web. But here, in order to have woodward web, we would need to have this. And so something that also there is, unfortunately, there is no lack of evidence, and sometimes the evidence is actually going against this, is that we really don't know what is the long-time persistence of this connection in the soil. And it's actually pretty unlikely, based on what we know about what is the lifespan of a mycelial hyphae in the soil. So, common mycorrhizal networks are frequent in forests. I would say that based on this is still inconclusive, especially because this study has been done on 2 trees, which are northern hemisphere conifers. So in Australia, we don't know. And then the persistence in the soil, we also don't know. And so the second claim, which I think is one of the most important, and it's one of the most that people have been doing a lot of surveys about this, is that trees can direct resources to their seedlings, right? So they use this network to say, oh, I'm doing good, but there's a seedling there that is needing help. It doesn't have, it's in a shade, it doesn't have enough sun for photosynthesis. I'm going to send carbon through. This is one of the major claims that have been done about this. And so in order to do this, what you do is that you measure the carbon transfer from one tree to the other. You know, if I have this carbon, you use what we call isotopes of carbon. So you label CO2. Let's see. Yeah, they did this with PCR in Switzerland. So basically, they put a little chamber over a tree, or it was usually small trees or seedlings or saplings, with this labeled CO2, and then they checked, can I find this CO2 in other trees, right? And this is exactly what they found. And this is one example of a study, but this has been repeatedly found in many places. We know that carbon transfer happened from one tree to the other based on this Nutrient, it's a little bit harder, but we know that carbon happens. So somehow, carbon that you label in one tree, or like this one molecule of carbons, because it was labeled, can end up in like in a tree further away. So this, we know that this is happening. This is happening. I think they found, let's see, yes, they found that there were like 40%, actually, so it's quite a lot of the carbon that could go through from one tree to the other. But, there is a but, there's always a but when you do science, which is why I love it. There is actually a lot of alternative explanation to this phenomena. And one that is the most important one is what we call wood exudate. So we know that the trees, they secrete sugar in the soil, right, to stimulate mineralization, for example, by microbes. They secrete hormones, you know, signaling. They do a lot of things is happening. Like they secrete a lot of molecules in the soil, and they do secrete carbon in the soil. And so there is something that is very simple that is called soil diffusion. It has been shown in many experiments. It has been shown in field study, where basically just through the soil, by diffusion through the soil, maybe it can be water dripping, maybe it can be along the fungal hyphae, but necessarily through the hyphae, inside of the hyphae. This molecule just can disperse in the soil and be absorbed by another sapling, right? And also close contact with surrounding wood. When we know that when you have two woods in the soil, we know like the soil is like full of woods everywhere, right? If two wood systems are just intermingled, some things that was secreted in the soil could be absorbed by another wood, right? And also something that we know that all these experiments about the carbon, sometimes they're biased because it's really hard to recreate a forest soil in your experiment, right? You have so many species that interact, you have so many things happening there that sometimes you have to simplify, but by simplifying, you introduce bias, right? And so what was very interesting with the story of the Wood Wide Web, and I think that in this case, the scientists, we are actually responsible for this bias, is that very often the alternative explanation to carbon transfer from one tree to the other have been neglected. Usually not in the studies. So their studies, they're very well made, very well done. There is a lot of discussion of the results. They talk about all the alternative explanation. But then the next person who's going to work out, interpret the data based on carbon transfer is going to say, oh yeah, but Truong et al. 2023 said that it was the Wood Wide Web. Even though in my publication, I said, no, but you know, maybe this is this, but there's a lot of other explanation. And so, unfortunately, alternative explanations, so far, they have been entirely neglected. There's a lot of studies that show there is soil diffusion, there's a lot of things that is happening others than the Wood Wide Web, but they have been entirely neglected. And so, for example, in this study, these colleagues in the UK, what they did is that they took two of these, I think it was pine seedlings. Oh no, it was spruce. They took two spruce seedlings and they labeled one and they tried to see if this was going through the soil, like if the carbon was transferring from one to them. But what they did is that they introduced what we call the mesh bags. So basically they put some kind of small tissue in the pot between the two seedlings so that the root could not get connected. So there's no way the root could be connected. And what they show is that the transfer of carbon was actually as high when the root were not connected than when the root were connected, which is a really good indication that in this case, this is all soil diffusion. The carbon is secreted in the soil and then it's absorbed again by the plant. So yes, there's a lot of transfer that is happening in the soil. Yes, the trees somehow talk to each other, but they don't necessarily do it through the mycorrhizal network. Maybe they can. Maybe there is a small amount of them that do, but there's a lot of other alternatives to this. And these alternatives, unfortunately, they have been entirely neglected by even scientists. And so, again, there's only there's few studies, only 2 studies that look at seedling performance and carbon transfer. So both the carbon transfer, but also how was the seedling actually doing better if there is this carbon transfer, or was the seedling not doing better? This is what we call plant soil feedback. Well, if you plant a seedling in the soil of its, close to these mother trees, or if you plant a seedling in a, in like a neutral soil, will the seedling do better when it's growing close to the mother tree than if it's not? It's actually very controversial. There is lots of studies that have been done all over the world, and the answer is that it depends. It depends on the soil type, the distance, the duration of interaction on neighboring plants. So yes, sometimes there is positive effect, but there's a lot of studies that showed negative effects, and a lot of studies that showed neutral effects, so no effect at all, right? But somehow this is what we say, there is this positive bias, is that people only keep the study that showed, oh yes, there is a positive effect. So here I'm not here to tell you that there is no positive effect. Sometimes there is, but not always. And we have to remember this. And so, do tree direct seedling to the direct resources to the seedling? There is a lot of alternative explanation, and then the seedling performance is not necessarily better. And so, because I was told I have to stop, I will just go really quickly. This is going to be very fast. To the third claim that I want to discuss with you is that the trees send warning message to their kins. Maybe you've heard about this. If there is an insect attack, the tree is going to send a message through the mycorrhizal network to warn the other trees about this. And so with this is actually really fast because there is no peer-reviewed study so far. So peer-reviewed is when you publish in a scientific publication, you're going to have a revision. So other scientists, usually on our free time, I have to say, we're going to review it and we're going to say, okay, can I have a look at the data? This is what I think. And then the editor of the journal is going to say, okay, I think this study is really good. We're going to publish it. There is no studies that have been peer-reviewed about this thing. So this is, so far, this is, and I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but it has never been shown or never been proven. And so with this, I will start by saying that, so I hope now we can all agree that what we know about the Wood Wide Web, based on scientific evidence, is that trees do form mycorrhizal association with a large diversity of mycorrhizae in the soil. We also know that mycorrhizal fungi, they thrive usually in low nutrient environment. So if you give fertilization, any kind of fertilization, including fire, which somehow releases nutrient in the soil, it may have a negative effect on mycorrhizal association. And then we do know that carbon transfer exists between plant and forest. This we know, it happened, it has been shown. But there's a lot of alternative explanation about, is this carbon transfer really through the mycorrhizae, or is it simply through the soil? Or maybe other microbes are also, important. And then what we know is that there is actually a negative bias against all these alternative explanations. I mean, it's an exciting time to work with mycorrhizal fungi at the moment, but if you work with other kind of fungi, I think sometimes you must feel so, neglected because it's all about the mycorrhizae, but there's a lot of fungi in the soil that are there that have very important function and that are still very neglected. And so what we don't know is that we don't know that these mycorrhizal common mycorrhizal network are frequent in the soil. We really don't know about this because there's only 2 plant species that have been studied. And then we don't know that the carbon is transferred between plants through the common mycorrhizal network. It could be through the soil. And then we don't know that the tree direct resources today you can enhance seedling performance because this is heavily variable. And then we don't know that trees send warning message to their kins because there is no study that have even shown this. And so, in conclusion, I would like to say that I think that this is time to really give fungi, the entire kingdom fungi, the place that it deserves in the soil. And so the way people have been looking at mycorrhizal network, it's almost like if fungi are an extension of the plant root. And it's usually because people starting working with this, they're interested in the plant, right? But I think the fungi have a lot to say about this in the in the interaction. And they actually have a lot to provide and to give in forest management as well. And they are not just there to be, I mean, even though I think it was a wonderful explanation, they are not just pipe that connect trees between each other, you know. They have their own life, and then they have their own strategy, and they have their own importance in the ecosystem. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Camille. That was a great myth buster. And I had a really good question to start with, but
yes.
You've already answered it. And that was my question was, how do they make decisions? And in fact, we don't have to ask that questions yet because we don't know that trees have to make decisions about who they give their nutrients to.
Yeah. So
the whole decision-making concept.
So that's interesting. We usually say about who has the control, who is really controlling the symbiosis. So there are experiments that have been done where people put, they inoculate. Usually the difficulties with this is that a tree in the forest is going to associate with its 30 species. When you work on an experiment, you usually do one by one. You inoculate one tree with one fungi. But what we know is that when the nutrient is high, the plant has a lot of control because it doesn't really need the mycorrhizal fungi, in the soil. While when the nutrient is low, then the fungi has a lot of control about, still, penetrating the plant roots. Because this is also something that it looks really simple, but it's not. So the plant and the fungi, they have to recognize in the soil that they can form a beneficial association. There's a lot of parasitic root parasites in the soil as well. So the plant has to kind of recognize, okay, this one is a good one, and this one, I'm not going to let it in. So usually when it's low nutrient, the fungus are more control, and high nutrient, the plant has more control. But it depends of, obviously, a lot of interactions. Yeah.
Can we have some questions from the floor? No.
I've got a bit of a problem with some things you mentioned there and in the previous thing and what I hear people speak of generally about these processes.
Mm-hmm.
Questions like the plant does this in order to get this from the fungi, or the fungus does this in order to get this from the plant. The trouble with that kind of language is that it creates in us an illusion that these things are doing it deliberately. They plan to do it. They know where the fungus is, so they grow towards it. Well, the fungus knows where the plant is and grows towards it. Now, that kind of cognitive understanding that these organisms might have of each other, there's no evidence, there never has been, of any of that stuff. If a plant responds to a fungus, or vice versa, it has to be through mechanisms that we understand, such as transfer of chemicals or so forth. But the idea that this is cognitive, it strikes me as completely ridiculous. And there's so much of that in what's written, and I must say in our common understanding.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I apologize if the language was not precise enough. I guess I was trying to, Yeah, no, it's hard to avoid, I agree. And I think this is a really good point, so thank you for noticing it. So the way, when we say this, the tree talks or they communicate, actually, so what is really happening in the soil, it's the communication is more chemical, right? So if what we call the rhizosphere, so the soil that is in interaction with the root, around the roots, this is where all this signaling is going to happen. And so basically, it's not that the plant obviously choose, I'm going to associate with this or that, but the plant recognized based on the chemical that the fungi is secreting, so this is a mycorrhizae, and then I'm going to let it in. So this was not a good language choice. And I think something that also is important to remember is that there is probably, so there is this, here we have a little bit of two ways, right? There's people who say there's cooperation in forests, and then there are people who say, no, wait a minute, there's a lot of competition in forests. I think that there is a little bit of both, actually, right? It's a mixture. And under some circumstances, if it's good for the plant to cooperate. When I say if it's good, it's not it's a choice that it makes. It's just that the environment makes the plant grow faster if it does it, then it's going to cooperate. So it's a bit of a mixture of the two. But yeah, thank you. Very nice comment.
Up the back.
So is what you're saying the plant's communication with the fungi is a bit like the way the plant communicates with light? So there's phototropism and geotropism to different like power angles, but then this one is a bit like the chemical communication, which we also have through our pheromones and stuff as humans. So the plants do that with the fungi.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of way of plants to communicate. And when we say the plant, send messages to the kids, to all these things, it's all about this wood exudate I was telling you about. This is what they do. They send hormones in the soil in response to an attack from like pathogens, right? And these hormones, they go in the soil, and obviously in the soil, because everything is interconnected, it's going to have an effect on the microbes in the soil and potentially other roots in the soil.
I guess if that we take that back to something Alison said about thinking like a fungus, using that as a model, then it just opens up another aspect of communication that we can all.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why I love working with fungi, because I think you have to stop thinking like a human and start thinking like a hyphae, and I think that's fascinating. But it's really a very, it is a communication, but it's a very different way of communicating, obviously, yeah.
Oh, well, Alice?
Thank you so much. I think it's fantastic you point out how limited these studies are and how little we really know. But all the studies we have, they're all Northern Hemisphere studies. How much do you think this might apply to our very different ecosystems here in Australia?
Yeah, thank you for this. It's a really good question. And I think that actually this is also something why we have to be so careful in Australia, is that the forests in Australia are so different than temperate northern temperate forest. There, you usually have a few tree species that are dominant, like, spruce, beech forest, for example, pine forest. And I think here, apart from some example, maybe in the mountain ash or some specific things, eucalyptus woodland, for example, there is no species that is really dominant. There's another thing also, a phenomenon that happens here is that a lot of trees in Australia, they have what we call dual mycorrhization, so they can associate with different types of mycorrhizae at the same time. This is something that is really rare in the Northern Hemisphere. So yeah, obviously, I think there's a lot of paradigm, there's a lot of concepts about fungi that have been developed in the Northern Hemisphere, and that may be totally different here. Yeah, that's why I was so excited to come and live in Australia, despite I had to wait a year during the pandemic to enter the country.
Sue, you have a question.
Oh.
I was fascinated, I know this is a comment, but I was actually fascinated by the title of your friend's paper. I don't know if I got it quite right, but, positive citation and over-interpreted data. And it just triggered in me how we see that in other areas, which I won't go into, but how this is kind of taken off and then it becomes popularised and it just goes, cool.
Yeah, and it actually influenced the scientists as well. Yeah.
Have you had any comment on that phenomena whereby it's not based on really sufficient studies, but somehow something becomes popularised?
Yeah. I think that one major problem, and I mean, I put the blame on the media here, but we as scientists, we also have the blame. I think one of the major problems we have today is that there is a lot of pressure for fundings, for example, we have to do like the sensational, study. Or if I want to get money, I have to say, oh yeah, with this plan, we're going to save the forest, or something like this. So there's unfortunately a lot of pressure that is put also to publish. In order to publish, if I say, oh, I found that the trees talk to each other, then I can go on to nature. Right? If I say, wait a minute, maybe this is only through the soil, then the story doesn't look so nice, and then it's harder to publish. So there's a lot of pressure nowadays, I think, on the journalists, on the scientists, to do these, sensational stories, and this is unfortunately not very good. Yeah. So I think I understood you were asking if there were studies on mycorrhizae with tree ferns, right?
Well, with ancient plant groups.
With ancient plant. So not in Australia, but there are very good studies that have been done by a colleague who is in the UK. So ancient plant, if we look at ferns or even mosses, they don't have real roots, right? So traditionally, it was said that they don't have mycorrhizae. But then these people, what they did is that they looked at they looked at the plant roots. They tried to culture what are fungal endophytes. So basically, fungal endophyte is fungi that live in an organ, so it can be in a root or in the plant leaf, and we don't know what they do there because there's no symptoms, so they're not parasite, or we think they're not parasite. And so they looked at these root endophytes, and they found that some of these groups were actually very close. So it was fungal group that were very close to mycorrhizae. So, and they put the hypothesis that actually this symbiosis might be much ancient than we think. So we think it started with the conifers, with the pine, which has like the true structure mycorrhizal, you know, like that, the way we know mycorrhizae. But they put it the hypothesis that this interaction with fungi was actually much more ancient. This is also something, I think, to go back to what Alison was saying, is that, for example, the concept of what is a nectar mycorrhizae was also based on northern hemisphere mycorrhizae. So the structure that they make, you know, that the fact that you see this mantle and, you know, the penetration of the root. In the tropics, it seems to be very different. And so they have started to call them endo-ectomycorrhizae because the definition doesn't really fit, right? But because of, obviously, I mean, a lot of definition come from Europe. And so, I mean, it's like, you know, we have to deal with this, but there's obviously much more than, yeah, what we think in other ecosystems.
Is there more questions? Okay. Oh, yeah. Any more questions? Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. That was super, super interesting. I don't really know how I want to phrase my question, so forgive me if I stumble through it. But I really enjoyed what you said about how fungi thrive with their mycorrhizae connections in nutrient-deficient systems.
Yes.
I work in conservation, and a lot of the time we're restorating pasture grasslands, really compacted soil systems. I guess I want to know that, like, what comes first in those situations? How can we advocate for good tree growth in how we're restorating systems that encourage the rhizae to come through and all the different systems of mycorrhizae there is?
Yeah,
Sorry,
that's,
I don't know. Does
no,
that make sense?
that's a great question, and I think that's one of the major challenges that we have now for integrated mycorrhizae in, you know, forest restoration and also in like tree production in nurseries, is that in this case, if you wanna, you know, have the plant to go faster or like go better, most of the time, and this is the example we had from this nursery, right, is that it's not necessarily going to be good for the mycorrhizal association. So this is really a big challenge, that how do we recreate this nutrient depleted forest when starting from like a nursery, right? And so I don't have an answer to this, but what I can tell you is that the most recent studies and the trend that have been done is to try to work with soil in general, and not only inoculation or, you know, putting something in the system, but try to use somehow soil from healthy forests if you can, to like use this as an inoculate. Or people have been trying to plant seedlings, if you can, like in the soil, and then transfer their seedlings to another place. But obviously, if you have a deteriorated land and then you want to restore it, I think the first thing you need to do is to look up, so what is the nutrient in my soil? And if you have a lot of nutrient because there's a lot of fertilization, then there's finding a way to how can we somehow remove the nutrient in the soil if you want to recreate like a natural environment, right? But this is very challenging because obviously here there is a little bit of competing, you know, factors, because obviously if you give nutrients to the plant, it's going to grow better in your nursery actually.